Good evening, everyone. Welcome. See some folks trickling in here. We'll go ahead and get started since it's 5:30. Thanks so much to everybody for participating or attending. My name is Nate Bauer. I am the director and the acquisitions editor for the University of Alaska Press. I'd like to welcome everybody here. I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement first things first. We acknowledge the Alaska Native Nations upon whose traditional lands our communities reside. Here in Fairbanks, our city and our university campus is located on the traditional lands of the Dana people of the lower Tanana River. We cherish the land on which we live and we depend, and we honor and respect the people who came before us and who are still here. Next, I would like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, Porphyry Press, who will also be hosting the recording of the event on their YouTube page once it's complete, for anybody who's not able to attend tonight. Also to the Homer Bookstore, Tom Kizzia's hometown bookstore there. They're also hosting this event as a live stream on their Facebook page. So hi to anybody who's watching there on Facebook. Special thanks to Max at the bookstore, who was a big help getting that live stream set up. I want to, before we go any further here, I want to post a link in the chat for everybody. Should be a clickable link here. This is a link to the Homer Bookstore's webpage to buy the reprint of Wake of the Unseen Object, which we're here to hear about and learn about from author Tom Kizzia. The bookstore page there is in the chat. I'm gonna open up the chat here so that people have a place for sharing comments and observations. I will ask that any questions for the author go into the Q&A window down here at the bottom. You should have a tab there for the Q&A and an option to enter your questions there. So questions for Tom go in the Q&A, and then other messages for Tom or for me, for Eric, go over there in the chat. We will be able to preserve the chat if you have messages for the author or comments or observations. There's also down here in the bottom a participants tab. You can click on that to see who else is here. I believe we had a request after our last event. People want to know who they're hobnobbing with here virtually. Yeah, without further ado, I'll get right into it. I know you don't want to hear from me. The secret of these things, though, is that this intro gives people a chance to show up a minute or two late. So welcome everybody who has shown up between the time we went live and now. Yeah, I'd like to introduce Eric Heyne, the series editor for the Classic Reprint Series. Eric has taught at the University of Alaska Fairbanks for over 30 years. He's a poet himself and a literary critic, an expert in fields of American literature, Northern literature, and the boundaries between fiction and nonfiction. Since 2018, he's been the special editor for our own University of Alaska Press's Classic Reprint Series, which has a proud and lengthy history of its own. He also happens to be a close personal friend. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Eric. Eric?
Hello. Thank you, Nate. Before introducing our guest of honor for tonight, I want to observe the passing this weekend of the founder and longtime editor of the UA Press Classic Reprint Series, Terrence Cole. Nate has already noted his passing and linked to his work in various places online and in broadcast, but I want to add my own condolences to his family, friends, and many, many devoted students. Terrence was a fabulous teacher and scholar, and he was also one of the funniest people I've ever known. I'm sure he would have had some devastating and hilarious things to say about this event tonight. And I'm very sorry I won't get to hear him crack wise one more time at my expense. We're here tonight to celebrate the launch of the UA Press reprint of The Wake of the Unseen Object by Tom Kizzia. Tom is the New York Times best-selling author of the book Pilgrim's Wilderness, many excellent magazine and newspaper articles, and the forthcoming book, Cold Mountain Path, The Ghost Town Decades of McCarthy, Kennecott, Alaska, 1938 to 1983, to be published in May by our partner for this launch event, Porphyry Press. Tom received an individual artist fellowship from the Rasmussen Foundation and was a Knight Journalism Fellow at Stanford. A graduate of Hampshire College, he lives in Homer, which is where he's beaming in to us from tonight. A few years ago, Nick Jans gave a reading on the UAF campus, and afterwards, my colleague Terry Riley and I went with Nick to the pub, something I so wish we could be doing tonight. Somewhere around the second beer, Nick asked us what we thought was the best nonfiction book about Alaska. Now, Nick Jans, as many of you probably know, has written several very good nonfiction books about Alaska. So Terry and I wondered if he was angling for a compliment, but he allowed for present company accepted. And Terry volunteered John McPhee's Coming Into the Country. And I think I waffled and named a couple of books by Nancy Lord. Nick asked us if we'd ever read The Wake of the Unseen Object, published in 1991 by Tom Kizzia. I not only hadn't read it, I hadn't heard of it. I prided myself on being a scholar of Alaskan literature, and I loved Pilgrim's Wilderness, which had just come out. So I immediately read Wake. Nick was right, I loved it. But I wished I'd read it 25 years earlier, and I wondered how the heck I had overlooked it for so long. So when I took over this editorship from Terrence, I decided to make it harder to miss the book by pursuing reprinting it with the UA Press. Tom liked the idea of bringing the book home to Alaska. The University of Nebraska Press, who held the copyright, was totally cooperative, and here we are. Ladies and gentlemen of the virtual realm, give it up in your living rooms for Tom Kizzia.
Thank you, Eric. That's great. I want to say how great it is for a writer to have his book discovered years later. And I also want to, given the subject, it seems entirely appropriate to thank the native forebears here in Homer, the Dena'ina people and the Inupiaq people who are still here on the bay. And I also want to remember Terrence Cole here, who I considered a friend and an inspiration, as well a friend and colleague from the Anchorage Daily News, Rosemary Shinohara, who passed away 2 nights ago at Providence Hospital from COVID. She was a longtime reporter and editor at the Anchorage Daily News, and probably edited a few of the stories that led to this book. So just wanted to start by saying that.
Thank you, Tom. You mentioned Rosemary and the Anchorage Daily News, where you worked for 25 years. The book you're reading from tonight started as a series of newspaper articles for them. What were the kinds of stories you went looking for in the bush?
Yeah, so this started out as a newspaper project for the Anchorage Daily News, a series called North Country Journal. And in the mid 1980s, I think the editors at the paper, I guess we had a slightly subversive goal in that we could sense the urban and rural parts of Alaska starting to drift apart. There was a lot of tension over subsistence hunting and fishing and a lot of other issues, state spending. And we thought that by telling the stories of rural Alaska to urban Alaska, we could, increase the understanding, I guess. That was our idealistic goal. But we wanted to do it with these small pieces of real life and not long thought pieces, or what we called thumbsuckers in the trade, and stories that were written in a way where you had to know what the weather was that day, that were short short pieces. I probably did 80 pieces over 2 years. And when it came time to do a book, clearly a collection of newspaper pieces wasn't going to be of interest in New York. So I spent 2 years rewriting and stitching it into a travel narrative. And that was what the book became, but it was drawn from these original stories. And you had asked me to do some readings, and one of the pieces I thought I'd read is just a short one, comes early. It's kind of one of the set pieces that feels a little bit more like the original newspaper pieces, even though most of the book has kind of lost that quality. So and this one I thought I'd pick because it conveys also, above all the other things that we were trying to do in those newspaper stories and talking about conveying the life and sentiment of rural Alaska, was to convey the sense of wonder and amazement that I felt and that a lot of travelers feel when they get out in that part of the world. So this was a story of a winter taxi ride from Athabascan to Bethel. This is the book. In the morning, I heard a horn blaring outside the teacher house. My taxi had arrived. Time for a trip down the Winter River with Roland Nose, bush entrepreneur. The morning was bright and calm, pleasantly cold. Roland Nose wore a light windbreaker and sunglasses and was chewing gum. Carrie Nose, his wife, sat beside him in the front of the white Chevy Blazer. She wrote my name in an account book in her lap. We started past the IRA office and turned into the first yard. I assumed he was going to turn around, but he didn't stop. We continued past the house and crunched across the snowy backyard, past a gray plywood steam bath, past a dog team staked in the willows, around 2 skiffs, and onto the frozen Kuskokwim. Next stop, Bethel, 23 river miles away. Business opportunities were few in Athabascan, and the Noses had gotten into the Tundra taxi line several years ago to come up with cash to support their growing family. At home, there were 11 little Noses: Robert, Roland Jr., Rita, Rona, Roxanne, Ryan, Ray, Regina, Ronald, Roseanne, and Randy. This was not a year-round operation, said Roland Sr. Maybe 4 months in the year, beginning in January, the river's frozen thick enough to support a family man in a 3-seat Chevy Blazer. When it's dangerous, we don't have to drive down, he said with a reassuring smile. We don't want to disappear. Such things happen on the Kuskokwim. The year before, a hole swallowed the front end of a nice late model Ford pickup traveling on the river. By the time help arrived, the truck was frozen immobile. Come breakup, the Ford went out with the ice, and people said it was down by the ocean someplace. One year, a ski plane crash landed on the river in front of Athabascan just shortly before breakup. The plane seemed destined for a trip to the Bering Sea, but the pilot repaired the skis, hired an Athabascan man to join him as river guide, and taxied down the rotting ice all the way to Bethel. Some holes on the river stay open all winter, created by currents or warm springs, Roland Nose said. A trapper from Lower Kalskag was lost in such a hole a few weeks earlier. I looked around the Blazer. Roland Nose carried no shovel or emergency equipment other than a VHF radio. Not on a morning like this one anyway, with lots of traffic and no wind off the delta to push drifts across the plowed lane. Where the ice beneath the tires was smooth, he cruised at 45 miles per hour in 4-wheel drive. When a car was coming the other way, he slowed, pulled into the snow, and waved. Halfway to Bethel, the ice road veered into Church Slough, a narrow curving channel through willows that cut off a big bend in the river. The snow on the slough was spotted with brownish green patches of what appeared to be water. One patch was steaming like a hot bathtub. Overflow from the tide in here, Roland explained nonchalantly. The Bering Sea. I felt my journey down the river coming to its conclusion. Roland sailed around a curve, spotted overflow in the middle of the lane, and fishtailed to the left around a green pool of slush. You thought we was going in a hole, he observed. The channel opened wide again, and soon the river cab was approaching the long waterfront wall of Bethel. Behind that wall were a hospital, restaurants, a couple of hotels, and jets to Anchorage. The trip from Alutiiq had taken less than 45 minutes. I pulled 2 $5 bills from my wallet while Roland maneuvered around a ski plane parked on the river and climbed a ramp into the neighborhood known as Loustown. He halted at a stop sign. No traffic was coming, but he hesitated an extra moment before pulling onto the main street. "You have to tell me how to get where you're going," he said. "I'm not too used to driving in town."
That's great. It's astounding to me, Tom, how you are able to show up as a stranger in a small community and have people open up to you in the most amazing ways. I mean, not everyone, of course, does, but one person will introduce you to another person, and that person will introduce you to a third. And at some point, you have access to a mini biography that also tells a much bigger story. And it's just amazing how that works. I wonder if you would read one of those sort of portraits of a person.
Yeah. Well, let me say though about that, a couple things come to mind. You know, it was different than in the 80s. There was not a place to shunt off the visitors to the village so much as there is now, to the villages. And I was imposing more on a kind of deep rural hospitality, and I hope not abusing it, but that made a big difference then, and I wonder how it would be now to meet the people in the villages, to try to duplicate this. Also, you know, I was there for the newspaper, so I had a excuse for asking nosy questions. A traveler who wasn't doing that, you know, didn't have that purpose out there, would probably have been more suspect. And I wasn't there, you know, to rip off the culture. I was there, as I explained, you know, we were trying to convey what it was like, how the world looked from out there, how the big looming city of Anchorage looked in the distance when it was over the horizon. And so, you know, I had a purpose out there. And I also had been briefed to some extent before going out there in some of the villages. I had friends, I had been covering Native issues for a year and a half or so before that. And I guess I had enough credibility that people were willing to talk to me and talk about, oh, you should maybe go to this village and ask this guy about, if you're lucky, maybe he'll tell you this story. Things that, you know, so I had a little bit of a starting point when I got to some of these villages. And I guess one other thought is that, you know, the interviews, as you can imagine, didn't always go well. And a lot of it had to do with my own clumsiness as a traveler and a reporter, and a lot of sort of dead ends. But I learned over time, and that learning process was one of the main, you know, narrative spines of the book. And it was also a kind of a revelation when I realized that that a bad interview was interesting in its own way. And so, especially early in the book, there are a couple of bad interviews that I spell out in scenes and try to get over time. So I would get to a village and I would have to improvise. The reading I picked was one from my trip up to Teller, north of Nome, which had started as a trading post. And what I didn't realize till I got there is that there were multiple villages that had kind of moved in out of the country and gathered around that trading post. So there were, you know, several different village native corporations and tribal affinities in that one place. You know, Brevig Mission and King Island and Nome and Mary's Igloo, and there was a Teller Corporation. And it was pretty interesting to sort of to plunge into that. And it was, you know, it was kind of like being like in, I don't know, Trieste before World War I, and all these, you know, clashing principalities trying to make their play for land and power. And so I kind of immersed myself in that. And then was grateful to have pointed out to me a book called People of Coeric by William Aquillic. One of the villages in the village corporations there was Mary's Igloo, which had come, the people had moved down from the Cousitrin River country and into Teller. And this was, William was the son of Mary's Igloo. And he had written this history in which he described the prehistory of that area, the three great disasters that had befallen the people of Coeric. There was an earthquake, a flood, and famine. And then the fourth disaster was the Spanish flu, which came through in historical memory and left so many of the people of Coeric and of that region orphans, just children surviving and parents not. So that was the fourth disaster. And he concluded saying, the fifth disaster is maybe today, as the kids can't remember anything and are losing touch with our past. So I was writing about that and gathering material, and then I stumbled on this meeting out on the waterfront, and I mention it because this is kind of what the book tried to find. As I passed the Village Youth Center in Teller, I looked in and saw half a dozen teenagers spending the sunny afternoon drinking Cokes and playing video games. It seemed a snapshot of the unfolding fifth disaster of the people of Coeric. At the landing, I helped a crowd of men roll a huge white septic tank into a skiff for a ride to Brevik Mission. The skiff rocked dangerously back and forth as it departed, top heavy with the tank, which filled it like a giant marshmallow. Nearby, one of the elders I'd met earlier was helping load a second skiff. Philip Kugsrook waved me over and introduced his son, a young man in a light jacket and torn blue jeans. Philip Jr. was about to head up the Cousitrin country. We sat on the gravel and talked about the effort to return to Mary's Igloo. The young Kugsrook was thoughtful and modest, but it was apparent he'd grown tired of all the nostalgic dickering. If I'm going to be here, he said, I want to be doing something. I'm not going to sit around and say, I'm caught, the future's bleak. Philip Jr. had lived in Wales and Teller when he was small, but he'd grown up in Nome and gone away to college in Fairbanks and Seattle. When the Claims Act came along and he could choose which village corporation to enroll in, he chose Nome. Later, he became interested in his Inupiaq roots and decided to move back onto the land for a time. He came to Teller in his mid-20s with the idea of moving up to the Cousitrin, but he'd been afraid the Mary's Igloo people would view him as an outsider and send him away. Instead, the older people whose permission he sought considered his interest cause for celebration. The decision to move up the river without subsistence and carpentry skills hadn't been easy, but it was the only way he could get started. I can't wait around here to have everything handed to me on a platter, he said. His father smiled proudly. Philip Jr. now caught most of his food. He commuted to Teller by skiff in summer for supplies and mail, and in winter he traveled by dog team. It was hard work. Even if you don't want to go out and check your net, he said, after checking it 1,000,000 times, you've got to do it. He was thinking of going back to college next year, but now he felt he had a home he could return to. Every time I go up, there's a strange feeling I get, he said. Just thinking about past gatherings, histories, wars, shamans, especially when you have a dog team running up the Cousitrin River in that evening light. Just to think that you're there in the space age and that your great-great-grandparents walked right where you were going. I was looking for moments like that to tell the human story of what was going on. And what happened next to him is a question, how did it work out? I don't know. Stories like that, took me like 10 seconds when you approached me about redoing this book, that I wasn't going to redo it or update it because, there would be 1,000,000 stories to update and you couldn't do it. But that really the subject is that dream of Philip Jr.'s, and that dream is still there on the page.
The debate going on in that chapter, one of the debates is about the resettlement of Mary's Igloo. And There are people on both sides, local people on both sides of that issue in that. And you have explored other tricky political issues within the Native community. Like, for instance, a few years ago in the New Yorker article called Whale Hunters of the Warming Arctic, you talked about conflicting political demands of the regional corporations, the village corporations, and some tribal organizations. So what are some of the challenges for a reporter writing about rural politics in the late 1980s and today? And I've already seen a couple of questions that are kind of related to that from viewers that are related to that issue.
Well, you know, the 1980s was a really lively time in that area. It was the Land Claims Act, which is 50 years old next year, was still new. The corporations were off and running, and there was, in the mid 80s, there was the first resurgence of tribal governments in rural Alaska, and those tensions were right out in the open. These days, they're much more below the surface. You know, these days, I think the Native leadership would sort of embrace corporation and tribe as, you know, two related vehicles for their work. But at the time, there was a lot of opposition between the two. I think, you know, the federal government has, you know, changed a lot of laws and started flowing money into the tribal organizations, and where the federal money flowed, you know, many flowers have bloomed. But at the time, if you, as a reporter covering the Alaska Federation of Natives meeting, you would hear the corporate leaders say, "Oh, well, you know, this is really a generational thing, and it'll." They were pretty dismissive in the first few years, and so it was kind of a shock when I got to the villages and saw how strongly some of these villages felt about the land claims corporations and loss of language and culture, and how they were turning to elders councils and getting, you know, dismissing, you know, actually undoing their municipal governments. And you know, I was in Athabascan in the winter for a convention of Inupiaq communities that was talking about all this. And, you know, when I was out there for the daily news, I mean, my assignment was, if I saw a good news story while I was out there, turn and walk in the other direction. They didn't, Howard and Pat, the editors, didn't want me, you know, getting distracted by my old newspaper instincts. But I kind of made an exception in this case because it was so amazing. There's in the chapter about Athabascan, I describe what it's like to be in a high school gym for a convention that's all entirely in Inupiaq. And, you know, this wasn't a couple of young, fiery young radicals. It was, you know, there were some young people, and there were lots of people in their 60s, and it was all spoken in Inupiaq. And then the second day, I'm just going to read a very short little piece from that, but the second day, three leaders from the AFN showed up to speak to them, and there was more English the second day because of that. But when the lawyer for AFN said, you know, you just don't understand how you're kind of getting in the way of the, you know, we're trying to present a united front in Congress to get some changes made in the land claims, and you're messing this up. And boy, did they take off after him. And then I'll just read this one thing, sort of at the climax of that. An old man with short gray hair jumped up and rattled in speeding Inupiaq. Elders in the gym nodded in agreement. It took me a minute to recognize the speaker as Peter Waski, the shopkeeper from Tuluksak. He was shouting. He strode to the front of the room, danced back and forth, and waved his arms in pantomime, said something about Russia. you could sort of hear a word now and then I could understand. He talked about gold mining and pointed at the representative from Chalista. He leaned over the table and thrust a finger in Janie Leask's face. Then he stepped back and, switching suddenly to English, pointed at each of them at the table and swept his arms sideways. 1, 2, 3, push him away a little bit. It was, wow.
Yeah, wow. Well, of course, we've got a couple questions in the Q&A related to your contacts with the people in rural Alaska. I'm gonna see if I can use this function here. Oh, maybe I can't. Maybe I'll have to ask them, and then Nate can help me put them out there. One question asks if you've maintained ties with people in rural Alaska whom you got to know. And another question asks, you mentioned bad interviews. Was there a strong distinction between on-the-record rural conversations and off-the-record ones, and how did you navigate that? So relations with the rural community is definitely an interest of our questioners.
Yeah, I've kept in touch with a little, and I had a few people reach out to me in the last couple of years. That's been really wonderful to reconnect. There were a lot of the portraits were in passing, but you know, they were part of the newspaper. They ended up, you know, running in the newspaper. So I always felt like if there was a problem that I would hear about it, you know, unlike the travel writer who goes to Afghanistan in, you know, the 60s and then comes back and writes about it and will never encounter those people. I would see people after my stories and after the book at AFN meetings. And so, yes, I did try to keep up with some, obviously not all. On the record, off the record, I always carried my pad around with me and would set it out on the table as a kind of flag. And there was some occasions where I felt like, okay, I better not write about this. This was, you know, there was, I remember one time visiting a family and there was, the wife was on a bad drinking weekend and, you know, I wrote about the family, but I didn't write about that. And it was, there was a certain discretion that seemed called for, but it wasn't like talking to a politician where you say, this is on the record, this is off the record. You know, they just, that sort of vocabulary didn't exist out there. So I tried to be respectful about that. And I figured, as I say, if I had overstepped, that I would be hearing about it.
Yeah, you mentioned the challenge of being a travel writer, traveling in some version of his own country or near his own country anyway, how small Alaska is. And of course, the book is not just a collection of separate newspaper stories for the paper. It's a carefully shaped linear narrative telling the story of your own education in modern rural Native life and politics. Can you talk a little about how you shaped your own persona as a character within the overall arc of the book?
Yeah, I did. You know, in the 1980s, there was a great vogue for literary travel writing. And I found that those writers had a lot to teach me about how to tell these stories, especially when it came time to writing the book and finding a way to arrive in a place and have my moods reflect what I was experiencing. I mean, I was learning so much as a writer, trying to make that, stitch that together as a narrative. But I also, you know, like, I realized when I went back to look at this book that I was sort of relying on that travel writing even as I was out there reporting. And this is sort of a story you can tell about yourself years later, but I was, I had with me on one of my trips, Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia. And there was a point where I was in the village of Wales, and I remember sitting in my tent. I was tenting on the beach to sort of keep out of the way at that point, and tenting on the beach, and I was reading Bruce Chatwin intently, and then I kind of threw the book down and threw myself out of the tent to walk through the village, and I felt like I was seeing the village with Bruce Chatwin's eyes, and sort of recording in my notebook things that he might have noticed. Here's the section where I did that. On my first night in a northern Eskimo village, I walked out to the water's edge, skirting the houses, uncertain how to approach. A reason for the beachfront alignment of the village became apparent as I walked. Families used the sand as an extension of their yards. The dunes beyond the reach of storms were neatly parceled into stacks of driftwood, valuable in a land without trees. Outboard motors, fish nets, snow machines, fire pits, heavy knives and wash pans, and bright bubblegum pink buoys, the chattel of an outdoor life. Wooden skeletons of walrus hide skin boats, the Inupiaqs, were elevated reverently on bony driftwood biers. Aluminum skiffs with their outboards cocked had been pulled up beyond the tide. Sifted through the soft gray sand at my feet were white bits of shell and bone, traces of 1,000 years of Inupiaq Eskimo subsistence. A sandy lane led between two rows of houses. Most were newer houses of the prefab sort now common in Arctic development, disconcerting to the traveler at first, so characterless and unrevealing. The whitewashed chapel and older houses with steep Cape Cod roofs gave the village a more particular flavor, a touch of New England primness. The satellite dish for village phones was tilted at the equator. These days you can always tell south in an Eskimo village. In the midst of all this, the New Age geodesic dome still didn't fit the pattern, or perhaps I had yet to comprehend the real pattern. That's, I realize now that was a sort of a telling last sentence, because trying to comprehend the pattern of what I was seeing was really a big part of my job out there, and it became my subject. You know, I think it's not at all accidental that unseen is part of the title of the book. You know, today there's a new vocabulary for this whole process of going out and reporting on a place, you know, of white privilege and cultural appropriation, and what was I doing out there trying to tell the world what was what I was seeing. I saw a great lecture recently in which a historian referred to heteropatriarchal settler colonial fantasies, and you know, it took me like a day to figure out what she was talking about. And
welcome to my world.
Well, then I realized she was talking about me. You know, the blinders to my ability to understand what was going on in front of me was one of my main subjects. And finding a way to get through some of that misunderstanding was the education of Tom was the became the plot of the book. You know, kind of moving forward, I guess. And if the book has you know, relevance now, 30 years later, a generation later, when we do have this new vocabulary, a new way of looking at relationships. If this book has survived, I think it may be partly because I sort of had that innate sense, even without the vocabulary, of sort of the limitations of what I was able to do out there, and was writing about that as well as trying to write about the native culture.
We have a question from a participant, which is close to what you're talking about. How did your rural travels shape your political views?
Well, I certainly ended up feeling a lot more empathy toward the perspective of rural communities trying to hold on to their traditions, understanding. I was going to, do you think there's time to read that store scene? There's one toward the end where I was in a little store out in a fish camp, and the troopers came flying into, Fish and Wildlife Protection came flying into the fish camp and came into the store and kind of laid down the law about the commercial fishing coming up. And in that scene, I kind of shrink into the shadows, and it was like I was seeing what these big men with guns on their, on their hips, blocking out the light as they walked into this, as they ducked in the door of this little store. And I could sort of see what it looked like from the point of view of the people who had been, fishing in this place for hundreds of generations, to have the law show up. And so there was that kind of evolution over time of political evolution of understanding, for me, and I hope I tried to convey some of that to the readers at the newspaper, and then later through this book. Probably not that many through the book, because it didn't never sell very many copies, but it's been great this last couple of weeks. All the people have said, "Oh, that's always been one of my favorite books," and I figured they must have been passing around the same 6 copies, because
I'm embarrassed to say that I first read it in the library copy. Do you want to read that store passage?
No, I think I've described it well enough. We can go on. You have other questions?
Well, I've been putting off the first question that we got, because it's a really good one, and I know it's one you're going to want to address. I love the title of the book. It's so beautiful. I'd like to hear more about the meaning of it for you.
Yeah, well, it comes from the last chapter, but once I had settled on that as my title, I kind of used it metaphorically throughout, including in the introduction. The origin was on the in the last chapter. I went out to the Black River Fish Camp on the coast of the Bering Sea, north of Scammon Bay. I went with a couple of families, and we stayed there for a week or longer. And even though camp life was structured around commercial openings now, there was obviously a lot of subsistence work going on as well. And it just felt like I was deep in a tradition that had been going on, as I say, for centuries. So while I was out there, let's see. Here was the origin of the Wake of the Unseen Object. On a calm evening, a few days later, when the air was cool and the river shone with a pink translucent, Glenn and his brothers and cousins stood along the cut bank, watching the water's surface for the sudden appearance of a V. "Kavlunak!" they cried, and ran to get long-handled dip nets. Kavlunak, the Wake of the Unseen Object. Kavlunak was the rippling of a salmon as it swam close to the pearly surface of the river. In Inupiaq, they said the fish was making eyebrows. Too young to go out alone in boats, the children waited on shore, their long-handled dip nets suspended in the water. They chattered in English, switching to Inupiaq when some aspect of their surroundings was recognized only by the indigenous language. Richard cried, "The fish are kavlunaking!" His insight was rewarded when an invisible king salmon entered his net. A cousin helped lever the 20-pound fish to shore, where it would proceed to Teresa Charlie's smokehouse. I tried saying the word and had to reach deep to pluck the cues. The sounds were unfamiliar, and Inupiaq vocabulary had not come quickly, Most of what passed at Black River in the old language I was missing. All I caught were a few expressive phrases, but sometimes these came as sudden revelations of what remained unseen. Kavlunak. For the next few days, I repeated the word out loud until people finally stopped laughing at my pronunciation. So I guess kavluk is eyebrow. And so the fish are making eyebrows. Or as it later, I went out on a beluga whale hunt, and it was also, that was how they would push the whales into the shallows, and you could see where the whales were in the murky seawater by watching for those wakes. For me, it was kind of a metaphor for everything that was going on, that I was able to see the old under the surface of the modern world, only by sort of inference and then, I guess there was also, although I was very shy in talking about this, there was a certain spiritual questing as well out there, trying to understand through the Russian church and their icons and the animism of the, pre-contact beliefs, whether there was, can you get any, is there something out there? And so you see the wake of that too, right?
Well, you're not going to be able to answer half of the questions that we've gotten here, but I think maybe I'll just read a few of them and then write in a row, and then you can answer the ones you want, the one you want to answer from that.
One more little reading, I'll do that.
Okay. There's a huge variety here from people who want to know, can you talk a bit about what was like filing your stories back in the day? To what might Philip Jr. say if you asked him the questions that you asked him today, do you think? To if the mask on the wall behind you came from one of the villages you visited? Nancy Lord asks, how did you write your new preface to put context to the original book? What issues did you feel you needed to address that had changed?
Okay, you're gonna slow down here. Let's see.
There's a lot of great questions.
Yeah. What was that first one? Well, the map is from, the mask is from Point Hope, from my more recent trip up for that New Yorker piece.
Well, one person asked what it was like filing the stories back then.
Yeah. I had a vision when I started that I was going to be writing in my tent in longhand, if I stayed in a tent or in someone's back room, and filing them from a distance. And one time I was in the village of Birch Creek, and I tried to file a story long distance, and something happened with the satellite link while I was trying to do that, and I cut the entire village off from communication with the outside world. I gave up that first summer trying to write that way. And I would come back to Anchorage, and I was living in Anchorage in those years, and I'd come back to Anchorage, and then I would just go into the newsroom and kind of bury myself in the trip and work, kind of like, 16-hour days off in a corner, just trying to get these stories written while they were fresh. And I learned over time to put things in my notebook that I hadn't normally put in my notebook, like the Hemingway line about what the weather was like. You need to kind of capture that at the moment. I learned I can't, even a week later, much less 2 years later writing a book, it's hard to get those kinds of details again. So I would come back and sort of disgorge that trip, and then I would catch up on my sleep and then go out on the next trip. And that system seemed to work better than trying to file remotely. This was, of course, in very early days of pre-internet days, and so that wouldn't have. It might be different now, even though the stories themselves would be different now too.
One of those questions was about what you felt like you had to address in the preface about change that's changed since the first edition.
Well, some of the things that I've talked about here, you know, that feeling of how the presumptuousness of a white guy going out and telling the world what it's like for indigenous people, that would be, I think everybody would be much more conscious of what was happening in that exchange now than they were a generation ago. And I think there will be more, you know, eloquent Native voices to tell that story now than there were then. So I wanted, so in the introduction, the new introduction, I do talk about that. But again, not meaning to apologize for what I did. I think that I was trying to explain how it affected me, and the reader could go along with me on that trip and maybe learn something in the process. And those were, you know, over time, the people who did say, "Oh, I liked your book," were often people who had been sort of white professionals who had worked in the bush at length, and that really seemed to capture my experience of it. So it's kind of the traveler's experience as opposed to laying down the reality of what was out there.
Another question asks, talks about a piece you wrote for CJR last spring called "What's Become of the Arctic," and is asking if you're writing the book today. Right in the middle of my reading the question, Nate transfers it to answer.
Well, today there's, you know, obviously climate change is a part of this.
That's what the question asks. If you're writing the book today, what role do you feel the toll taken by the climate crisis in recent decades would play?
Well, that was kind of first, that was at the forefront of that New Yorker piece about the North Slope Burrow and the people who, you know, the whale hunters up there who were, they couldn't get their whales onto the ice because it was too thin, you know, and the whales, although the bowheads are doing well biologically, their migration seemed to be shifting. You know, I think the point was that here's a culture that is more affected by climate change in a more sort of immediate and vital way than most Americans, and yet they have, you know, what is it, $300 million annual operating budget for those 8 villages. It's a huge, the civilization they built now is based on fossil fuel production because their income comes from the property tax value of all the oil facilities on the North Slope. And so they're the most affected and the most dependent. And so they're like America writ large, right? You know, our American culture is like that. So in that sense, that story is really important. You know, another change right now, and I mentioned this in that new introduction, is the loss of the generation of elders who were still, you know, when I was out there, and you know, I didn't realize I was capturing a historical period at the time. It was just, it was the present, and now it seems like another time. And the loss of that generation of elders is, I'm sure, felt out there. If I were to go back, that would be different. But the book was not ever meant to be elegiac or to write it to be about, you know, vanishing Americans. It was about contemporary Americans and trying to write about a very present people who had a right to be listened to in Alaska. We have you know, in federal law, there's the phrase tribal consultation, but this was consultation with the first people, whether you're consulting with the tribes or with the corporations. It was really just about the people themselves. So I was going to read one more thing before we run out of time here.
Yeah, let's end the meeting. But Nate, would you just go ahead and put all the rest of the questions in the answered category so everybody can see them? I mean, it's just so people can read the questions. We won't have time to address anymore, but there's so many great questions there.
I'm looking forward to reading them afterwards here. Yeah. Okay, so this was out in the Black River, and with Glenn, who was 12 years old and who is now teaching out on the Delta. That afternoon, oh no, I got this side wrong. Here we go. The door of their cabin stood open. The river outside, the tundra beyond. During the day, Richard, Glenn's brother, had pointed out 3 small figures, a mother and 2 children, holding hands as they walked far from camp. I'd imagined them to be engaged in some timeless gathering activity. Perhaps they were looking for eggs. The larger birds' nests were off limit now, part of a cooperative agreement with federal authorities to protect declining goose populations. But smaller eggs were still part of the fish camp diet. What are they looking for? I asked Richard. Shoes. Shoes? One of their dogs took some. I realized that I had yet to leave camp on the riverbank and see the tundra myself, so after supper, I pulled on my rubber boots. The golden evening hours were beginning. I picked a winding course along the edge of ponds and clear streams, doubling back off dead-end peninsulas. Black earth bubbled beneath my boots. It was a country without wood or stone. The grass was short and chaffy, still brown from winter, but fresh blushes of green followed the water courses, where small swimming birds skittered and splashed away from my advance. A circus clatter of bird life was all around. 5 geese flew low to the ground in a V, making eyebrows for the coast, and intent on getting there in the next few seconds. I was heading vaguely east toward the mountains. Far ahead, 2 sandhill cranes danced noisily on stilt legs, lunging, broad wings outspread. I picked them as a destination. After a while, I stopped and looked back. With the river dropped out of sight, the camp looked like a prairie boom town in a movie western. A line of wall tents out in the treeless open, with a few wood frame buildings adding a tentative permanence. I counted 30 tents and half a dozen plywood shacks. Usually the Black River camp is seen from the water. This was an unusual perspective, perhaps known only to gatherers of eggs and shoes. I spotted Glenn in the distance, following my trail. The family's golden dog chased in excited circles beside him. Myron had said, if they decided to leave tonight, they'd send Glenn for me. I started back. By the time I drew near to their messenger, he was wading thigh deep across a pond, exploring in the shallow muck, and in no apparent hurry to catch up with me. Glenn was studying the sucking sensation produced by a pair of hip waders his mother brought from the store in Scammon Bay, a present for his first commercial fishing trip. A shrewd investment, since every night Glenn returned to camp wet and muddy to his knees. Dogs are better than people. You know why? Glenn said as he splashed out of the pond and caught his breath. Dogs find more little birds' eggs than we do. He held out his hand. In his palm were 3 small eggs, the size of macadamia nuts, outfitted in a camouflage pattern of green and brown. Did you see any nests? Glenn asked. Did you see any birds flying funny? I took the eggs and we started for the river. The eggs felt warm. Was it the warmth of his hand, or had they been warm like this in the grass where he found them? I felt I was walking home with something tugging at my fist, the heart of the tundra, a living thing. Kavlunak.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you, Nate.
Thanks, everybody.
Magnificent. Wonderful. Yeah, I want to extend a big, grateful, big-hearted thanks to the author and to the editor, to Tom and Eric. And I am gonna thank everybody for being here. Thanks to everybody that attended. I will observe in the chat, Tom, that everybody I think that did buy the book originally are here, and they're commenting that they're very proud. to have bought it. You know, the six people. So maybe maybe a coffee session with the original purchasers of the book is in the cards sometime in 2021. But for anybody who doesn't have the book, or for anybody whose copy is particularly worn, or anybody who wants to have a copy of the new introduction, which is really brilliantly written by Tom, I am going to post the link in the chat one more time for people to buy the book online from Homer Bookstore. Yeah, thanks again to everyone. Happy holidays, and we'll be sure that you know about our next event the next time we have one.
Thanks, Nate, and thanks, Eric. I appreciate it a lot.
Thanks all. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.